In terms of my background and my long-term interest in the interface between science and religion, this traces back to my childhood, because I was raised in a very religious family, my father being a Protestant theologian, but from the age of 13 I was totally committed to pursuing a career in science. But it struck me as I grew through my teens that there seemed to be very little dialogue and virtually no integration between the whole scientific worldview, not just a method, but a scientific worldview, and the Christian worldview, and that was the religion in which I was raised, the Christian worldview. And so there was a dissonance between these two, and I didn't see any clear resolution or any viable attempts that were, to my mind, at all compelling for integrating a spiritual and a scientific view of our own existence and reality as a whole. And so that was really, in a nutshell, why at the age of 21 I disengaged from Western civilization and devoted the next 13 years to immersion in Tibetan culture, language, religion, becoming a monk, 4 years of a series of meditative retreats, an immersion in another culture that didn't have this dissonance between a highly empirical and rational understanding of reality and one that was deeply spiritual. And Tibetan Buddhism does not have that dissonance. After a 14-year hiatus, from the age of 20 to 34, I felt the time had come, when I was 34, to try to reintegrate back into my native civilization, try to integrate some of the insights, the wisdom, and the panoramic view of Tibetan Buddhism with the insights, the wisdom, the very broad view of modernity, try to integrate this in a very meaningful fashion. So this brought me back to complete my undergraduate education at Amherst College in physics, which is the paradigm of the natural sciences, and that was now more than 20 years ago. And ever since then, it's just been an ongoing process of integration. I explicitly wrote this book, Mind in the Balance, for my stepdaughter. Her name is Sarah Volland, and she expressed to me an interest. In fact, she asked me to give her a birthday present of a book. Because she had read, or she had looked at a number of books I'd written thus far, and they were either too technical as Buddhist books or too academic as academic books, and she wanted something more accessible that would address the fundamental existential issues she was grappling with as an individual and as a mother, because she wanted to offer the best she possibly could to her son, Troy. And she said, please write a book for me and for my son, addressing the issues of what is the nature of human identity, the meaning of life, the nature of the mind, the nature of meditation, how does it interface with modern science, what does it mean in this modern world, how should we lead a meaningful life. So she was my direct audience, but I was willing to devote the time and effort and so forth in researching and writing this book, on that one hand because I love her and wanted to offer her my best, but I also thought, how many other millions of people are there like her who are very open to and respectful of science, but don't find all they need for their own existence, a meaningful life, in science alone. She was very, very open to, very receptive to Christianity, but to Buddhism as well, and was looking for something that was not institutional, not something dogmatic, not something to join, but rather a path of practice and a way of viewing reality that would make sense across the boards, make sense philosophically, scientifically, from neuroscience, from physics, and so forth, but also make sense in terms of Christianity, make sense in terms of Buddhism, that it fits together, not trying to make one new religion, which is never considered, or to be a silly notion, but to be able to lay out a path of theory and practice that makes sense in a Christian context, makes very good sense in a Buddhist context, it's deeply drawing from the Buddhist tradition, but also makes sense from a scientific perspective, but doesn't necessarily make sense from the perspective of the metaphysical view of scientific materialism. And I'm drawing a sharp distinction there, that we can have extremely viable, rigorous, critical science without, frankly, the metaphysical baggage of scientific materialism, which I think is doing no favor to the scientific community and is completely incompatible with both Christianity and Buddhism and, frankly, every other religion on the planet. Scientific materialism is off in a corner by itself. I think it's hampering scientific inquiry, and it's incompatible with every spiritual tradition on the planet. I do, in one of the early chapters of the book, trace the origins of meditation within the Christian tradition, going back to the Desert Fathers, even going back, of course, to the life of Jesus himself, but then tracing back in terms of influences, going back to the Platonic tradition, the Pythagorean tradition. So I trace back to Pythagoras himself, who was a contemporary of the Buddha, trace that whole trajectory, not in a great deal of detail, but I do trace it from the Desert Fathers and then on through the Neoplatonic tradition, through the medieval period, and up to the 15th century, when we are celebrating this extraordinary individual, Nicholas of Cusa, who was a cardinal, in the Roman Catholic Church, and a brilliant Renaissance man, and a very profound mystic. So I trace that. To a much lesser extent, I trace some of the history and the development of the Jewish mystical tradition, contemplative tradition, the Kabbalah. But the emphasis here really is on Christianity, with a sidelight on the influences of Judaism and itself, of course, as an autonomous tradition. It's not reliant upon Christianity. And then tracing the interweaving of this with the Buddhist tradition, but looking more thematically rather than historically on the historical interface between Buddhism and Christianity. Thematically, what are the common grounds? And frankly, I am unabashed in my approach here. I'm not really seeking out and highlighting differences. The differences are a little bit too obvious to comment on. They're perfectly obvious. We know them. What is often concealed by people who do highlight differences, and these are both very committed Christians who are very keen to show the uniqueness of their own tradition, frankly, Buddhists as well, but also academics. On the whole, they're much more interested in differences. The whole postmodernist perspective, all of this, they're highlighting differences and incommensurability. They love that phrase. And I am looking for the opposite. I say, okay, you've done your incommensurability. You've done the differences bit. Been there, done that. Now let's just focus on the common ground. Because after all, we're living here in the same planet, community, and if we can seek out and highlight the common ground, this is going to give rise to more harmony, more mutual understanding, than always coming back to the differences and differences. So it's not to try to ignore the differences, but I figure they're kind of obvious. And here's a book that is simply highlighting the common ground between the Christian and the Buddhist, and then secondarily the Jewish and the Vedanta within the Hindu tradition, highlighting the common ground and suggesting something I do believe in, that among these very, very deep contemplative traditions, East and West, they are converging on some common reality, a very deep transcendent reality. And if that is true, and I came to this conclusion when I was 21, if that is true, the reality on which, or towards which, these great contemplative traditions are converging, that is the most important reality that human beings can access. And from my perspective, that's worth devoting at least one lifetime to. The scientific study of the mind and of consciousness as a natural science stands in a category all by itself. All of the other natural sciences, from astronomy to botany to geology, you name it, all of the natural sciences have as their primary mode of inquiry the direct, meticulous, sophisticated observation of the phenomena they're trying to understand. And we start with Galileo. He was trying to understand what is the relationship between the sun, the moon, the planets, planet Earth, and the stars. And of course, his great innovation was using the telescope in unprecedented ways to carefully, in unprecedented ways, observe the phenomena that he was interested in. And he did the same thing for terrestrial phenomena. Very, very careful observation. He is truly the father of modern science. That, with the mathematical analysis, the whole notion of hypotheses and theory testing, it's an absolutely spectacular method, and it's driven at its core by direct observation of the phenomena you're trying to understand. Modern science, the mind sciences, which have been around for about 135 years by now, have still not developed any sophisticated means for directly observing mental phenomena. Now that, I think we should really pause. That's strange. They're very good at observing behavior, and they're extremely good at observing brain states. And they've made no progress at all, beyond folk psychology, untrained introspection of observing mental phenomena themselves. This is what the contemplative traditions of the world are very good at. Buddhism is spectacular. Christianity has a noble heritage, as do the others. And so the direct observation by way of meditation, training first of all attention, which is basically your telescope for observing the space of the mind, developing what in Sanskrit is called samadhi, now a term we've embraced in English. This should be the primary mode of inquiry into the nature of the mind, the origins, the potentials of the mind, the nature of consciousness. It just makes good sense. This makes scientific sense. This is what we should have been doing all along. But frankly, it was the dogma of scientific materialism that snuffed out that line of inquiry. And it's time to relight that candle. And frankly, I'd be quite happy to snuff out the dogma of scientific materialism. So it's because of the primacy of the direct observation of the mind, mental states, emotions, dreams, thoughts, states of consciousness, multiple states of consciousness, and that is start training the attention as we've gone from Galileo's 20-power telescope to the Hubble telescope. I mean, how much more we have learned by developing these great telescopes, especially in the 20th century. That was the breakthrough century for understanding not only that there are stars, but in the 1920s, discovering there are multiple galaxies, 50 billion to 100 billion of them. You get that by not just bringing out the 20-power telescope and looking again and again and again, but developing the telescope to greater and greater precision, depth, magnification, of course. This is an unexplored territory in the scientific study of the mind. I mean, utterly unexplored. Developing the power of samadhi from folk level, which is what we have right now, in any psychology or neuroscience department right now, they're bringing in amateurs to observe their own mind. They've left the direct observation of mental phenomena in the hand of amateurs, untrained, naked eye, basically. And so develop samadhi, and develop it beyond what you can do in a 10-day retreat, beyond what you can do a 3-month retreat. Make this a professional training, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of training, like what we have in the natural sciences. There's nothing anomalous here, but develop highly trained professionals to directly observe and fathom the depths of the nature of awareness and multiple dimensions. And this will open up a whole realm of the scientific inquiry of the mind. I think history, if this does happen, I think history may look back upon the development of natural sciences and say the first 135 years was a drum roll. It was waiting for mind scientists to develop a viable method for observing the mind penetratingly so, by direct observation. It hasn't happened yet, it could happen soon, and that actually might mark the true beginning of its scientific study of the mind. And what we have right now is scientific study of behavior, scientific study of the brain, with a lot of derivative benefits for studying the mind. There are, of course, many forms of meditation, just in the Buddhist tradition alone, let alone going into Hinduism, Christianity, and so forth. One practice that we find east and west, we find in all schools of Buddhism, and we find in Christianity, and I'm sure you'll find it elsewhere, mindfulness of the breathing. It's a practice that, as we attend to just to the sensations of the breath, as they arise throughout the body, or perhaps more focused at the apertures of the nostrils, doing this practice for even 20 minutes or 30 minutes a day, it's tangibly, manifestly good for you. It soothes the nervous system. It relieves stress. It calms the mind. It brings about greater clarity of attention. It enables one in a very gentle way to develop greater sustained attention, so we can focus our attention at will for longer periods of time. This is good for interpersonal relationships, that when we're engaging with a friend, a spouse, a child, we can keep our attention focused on that person for more than a few seconds before we go off into associative thinking, or the mind just gets distracted. It's good for business, it's good for athletics, it's good for education, it's good for mental health. Mindfulness breathing, very, very helpful. There are many forms of meditation that are locked into or inextricably tied into a particular worldview. And I think that's fine. There's centering prayer in the Christian tradition that is very much Christocentric. It's about Jesus. There are other practices within the Christian tradition that are really focused. First of all, you embrace the Christian worldview, and then you practice Christian meditation. And I think that's wonderful. And the same is true in Hinduism, in Buddhism, and so forth. And there are some practices, we find a lot of them in Buddhism, but certainly in other traditions as well, that are not necessarily linked to any particular belief system, for which no leap of faith, acceptance of divine authority or authority of a tradition or of a teacher is needed before you can venture in. And so the practice of mindfulness breathing fits that to a T. You don't need to believe anything. Try it out. See whether it's helpful. If it's not, find another practice. If it is, by all means, carry on. There are other practices of simply observing the mind, which I've taught on many occasions. These too require no pre-given beliefs or an acceptance of a creed. Venture into it, start attending to your own mind, and see what happens. Now this is very cognitive. There are other practices that I don't elaborate on so much in this book, Mind in the Balance, but practices for cultivating the heart, cultivating empathy, loving kindness, compassion. Buddhism has marvelous methods in this regard that any devout Christian could practice with absolutely no conflict with their values, their ethics, their worldview. There's just nothing incompatible. And that goes for Jews, it goes for Hindus, and frankly it goes for humanists. People don't embrace any religion, or maybe they're atheists. Fine, be an ethical atheist and cultivate a good heart. So cultivating a good heart, developing intention skills, developing metacognitive awareness of our own mental states and processes. This doesn't require that we be religious. It doesn't require that we be religious in any particular way, east or west. It does require that we have an open mind, which is sometimes difficult to come by, and that we have a true aspiration, a genuine, sustained aspiration to cultivate our inner resources, to draw forth our inner resources, to bring forth virtues that we already value, of clarity of mind, of presence, of equanimity, of mindfulness, a loving heart. There are plenty of practices of this sort, which the religious and the non-religious can easily follow. And really all of the practices that I set forth, a whole sequence of meditations that I describe in Mind in the Balance, they can be followed by Christians all the way through, by Buddhists all the way through, and frankly I think by open-minded scientists who have no religious beliefs whatsoever, but have an open mind and are willing to be critical of their own unexamined assumptions. This is open for everyone, let alone people of other faiths. There are many forms of meditation that are locked into or inextricably tied into a particular worldview. And I think that's fine. There's centering prayer in the Christian tradition that is very much Christocentric. It's about Jesus. There are other practices within the Christian tradition that are really focused. First of all, you embrace the Christian worldview, and then you practice Christian meditation. And I think that's wonderful. And the same is true in Hinduism, in Buddhism, and so forth. And there are some practices, we find a lot of them in Buddhism, but certainly in other traditions as well, that are not necessarily linked to any particular belief system, for which no leap of faith, acceptance of divine authority or authority of a tradition or of a teacher is needed before you can venture in. And so the practice of mindfulness breathing fits that to a T. You don't need to believe anything. Try it out. See whether it's helpful. If it's not, find another practice. If it is, by all means, carry on. There are other practices of simply observing the mind, which I've taught on many occasions. These too require no pre-given beliefs or an acceptance of a creed. Venture into it, start attending to your own mind, and see what happens. Now this is very cognitive. There are other practices that I don't elaborate on so much in this book, Mind in the Balance, but practices for cultivating the heart, cultivating empathy, loving kindness, compassion. Buddhism has marvelous methods in this regard that any devout Christian could practice with absolutely no conflict with their values, their ethics, their worldview. There's just nothing incompatible. And that goes for Jews, it goes for Hindus, and frankly it goes for humanists. People don't embrace any religion, or maybe they're atheists. Fine, be an ethical atheist and cultivate a good heart. So cultivating a good heart, developing intention skills, developing metacognitive awareness of our own mental states and processes. This doesn't require that we be religious. It doesn't require that we be religious any particular way, east or west. It does require that we have an open mind, which is sometimes difficult to come by, and that we have a true aspiration, a genuine, sustained aspiration to cultivate our inner resources, to draw forth our inner resources, to bring forth virtues that we already value, of clarity of mind, of presence, of equanimity, of mindfulness, a loving heart. There are plenty of practices of this sort, which the religious and the non-religious can easily follow. And really all of the practices that I set forth, the whole sequence of meditations that I describe in Mind in the Balance, they can be followed by Christians all the way through, by Buddhists all the way through, and frankly, I think by open-minded scientists who have no religious beliefs whatsoever, but have an open mind and are willing to be critical of their own unexamined assumptions. This is open for everyone, let alone people of other faiths. So to elaborate a little bit more on our project on the island of Phuket, I'm working with a man who's become a very dear friend and a very respected friend, a German philanthropist, entrepreneur, or businessman named Klaus Hebben. And so he is the philanthropist behind this, the person who's making it possible financially. On the island of Phuket, he's bought a whole valley, about 50 acres, and there we're right now in the process of establishing a K through 12 private school, international school, that will eventually provide education for 700 students. We're putting in a world-class, by any standard, a world-class athletic center with a 25-meter pool, a 50-meter pool, track and field, football, tennis, gymnasium. It's going to be world-class. As a training center for professional athletes and very serious amateur athletes from around the world to come there for intensive training, athletic training. These were two projects Klaus was already establishing before he and I came into collaboration on this point. And now, in addition to these two, we're also building now a 40-room meditation retreat center called the Phuket Mind Training Academy, which will be part of the Phuket International Academy. And here, this will be 40 rooms, all of them having private accommodation, their own shower, toilet, air-conditioned. It's going to be beautiful. And we will be able to start our first 80-day retreat, which will be one of a whole series of 80-day retreats, probably interspersed with 8-week retreats, starting in April of 2010. I think this will turn into, or at least has the potential to turn into, a very significant research facility for the first-person investigation, exploration of the nature of the mind, the multiple dimensions of consciousness, but we'll have also one room specifically allocated as a scientific research lab. And so we will equip that, and we will make this open for researchers from around the world to come, get their own grants for research, come to Phuket and be able to study the effects of these people engaging in 80-day retreats. But the 80-day retreats will really be a launching pad for those who find a vocation in contemplative training and would like to spend 1 year, 5 years, 10 years in professional, sustained, rigorous training. So they'll be able to start in Phuket, and then I'm working with people around the world where people can get their initial training in Phuket and then go off to a satellite, a retreat center, one of quite a number around the world, where they can continue again for 1, 5, 10, 15 years and really go professional. And the scientists, I'm sure, will want to study the effects, the longitudinal effects of such training as well. So I think meditation by itself does not hold all the answers. But like for any natural science, the primary way of understanding the phenomena you're seeking to understand is by observing those phenomena. The sciences of the mind now don't do that. The contemplative traditions do. But Buddhism, as one major contemplative tradition, has no science of the brain, and it has no quantitative science of behavior. These are very meaningful, indirect approaches to studying the mind. And so the vision here, which is really basically a revisioning of the vision of William James himself, the great pioneer of American psychology, that the study of the mind should be threefold. First, foremost, and always, it should highlight the direct observation of mental phenomena, and since the only phenomena that we can directly observe, at least at the outset, are our own, introspection must play a key role. That should be primary, but there should be these ancillary approaches which are very important and which Western science is very good at. Studying the mind indirectly by way of behavior, studying the mind indirectly by way of the neurocorrelates of specific mental states and processes. We can bring these together, integrate them in unprecedented ways, which may shed light on the nature of the mind and its relationship with the brain and the body and environment that Buddhist meditation has never revealed publicly in any way, in any case. But we also, through this integration of the contemplative with the third-person methods of modern science, may open up whole new horizons of the nature of the mind and the multiple dimensions of consciousness that right now remain utterly hidden to the scientific community. So I believe the interface here is unprecedented. Science is doing very well for what it's doing, but it's extremely limited because it's studying the mind only by way of its physical correlates, which means naturally the mind scientists are locked into a materialistic vision of the mind. But this was predetermined by the methodologies. It's not a conclusion, it's a starting assumption that never got challenged. The contemplative traditions, observing mental phenomena themselves, which have no physical attributes whatsoever, are not locked into the preconception that the mind must be nothing more than the brain or a function of the brain. Happily, they have much broader bandwidth of hypotheses and possibilities for understanding the mind than those who are locked into a materialistic methodology, and therefore, of course, materialistic conclusions. So this may revolutionize, bring about the first revolution in the mind sciences, and it may bring a new zest, a new vitality, a freshness to the great contemplative traditions of the world, which in the eyes of many people look old. They look out of date. They look old-fashioned. Bring them into the 21st century.